All right, we're going to move into how to look at our data graphically. So these are 3 principles of making categorical graphs, although these principles really do apply to just about any time you're trying to represent your data graphically. So these 3 principles are think. So picture is often the best way to communicate your data with others. I think this is a really great way of talking about how overwhelmed people can be and we don't recognize it. It does a really great job of saying that in just a picture. It shows important features as well as patterns in the data. And analyzing the picture will reveal things that you're not likely to see in a data table. Okay, this is very true. One of my first jobs, I worked as a lifeguard at a swim center, and I helped the person in charge of running the snack shack. And interestingly enough, hot food was super popular, even though it was just microwave stuffs. And not really sure why it was so popular, but it was. We always had a very long line. And so I looked at the numbers and I ran a report that showed how much we were selling in hot food each day versus how much we were selling in things like ice cream or chips or candy. And so I printed this list out and brought it to my boss and said, hey, we could really use some more microwaves in here. We can justify this with the amount of money that people are spending. My boss just kind of glanced at it and was like, no. And I was like, but that's clearly our biggest seller by a lot. And that's what holds up the line just because it takes time for things to microwave. So I went back and I put the data together graphically. So I made a chart that showed the sales for hot foods versus the sales for ice cream and candy and so on. And it was really clear that that difference for the hot food was there was a lot of money where the next closest category was a whole lot smaller. And so when my boss saw that, he was like, oh, sure, yeah, you can buy a couple more microwaves. Right? So making that graphical illustration is what convinced my boss that this was a good move for the business. And so a lot of times people aren't able to look at a long list of numbers and make sense of them. But if you can display it graphically and you do a really good job of that and communicating what's going on, it's amazing what you can do with that. Okay, so here are a couple more examples of graphs. These ones are a little more complex. But again, your graph can be anything from simple to complex and still convey that message. All right, let's look at an example of this. You guys might have seen this one floating around on social media. So this is from World War II, and the Navy was concerned about the number of aircraft that they were losing. And so what they did was the planes, when they came back, they would mark down where all the damage was on the planes. And then they decided that they were going to reinforce those areas because that's where the planes are getting hit. A statistician named Abraham Wald looked at that and he went, oh, you guys are missing something here. Okay, and what they're missing is that the planes that took hits there where that damage is, those planes still made it back to the base. The parts where there was no damage, right? So if we look at this picture on the engine and on the nose cone, which is probably where the pilots are sitting, right? We don't see any marks there. And that's because the planes that got hit there, those planes went down and never made it back to the base. So rather than putting extra armor on the places where these dots are all at, the place that you needed to reinforce is actually the place where there were no dots, right? And so just because you've collected that data and you've made an illustration, you really still have to think through what those ramifications are really showing you there, okay? We'll come back in the next video and take a look at Florence Nightingale, who was a famous nurse. That might most likely, if you've heard of her, know that's where she came from. She is also the first woman inducted into the British Statistical Society. She had a big impact on statistics and the making of graphs. So we'll take a look at that next.